Tarek Holloway has never been the type to brag or talk about his past. At 19, when many of his peers were partying or thinking about their majors, he had already endured the brutal years of war as a specialist in the U.S. Army. When he returned from the war, Tarek sought neither praise nor pity. He chose the quiet path, enrolling in Lakewood Community College to pursue his dream of becoming a journalist. No uniform, no medals, no introduction saying he was a veteran, just a quiet black boy who sat in the middle row of the classroom. Close enough to hear but far enough away to go unnoticed. Tarek showed up to class on time, listened attentively, and rarely spoke. He didn't need anyone to know who he was. But unfortunately, in a society where prejudice still exists, that silence sometimes cannot protect him from wrong views, like the way a teacher, just through a name and a nod, hastily assigned him a heavy prejudice. From the first weeks of the semester, Tarek sensed the difference, not in the knowledge, but in the way he was treated. He handed in his paper on time, a thoughtful essay about post-war trauma that, while not personal, showed empathy, and yet, in response, he received a big red C followed by a curt comment, lack of depth. Tarek didn't react, but he observed, and what he saw was a series of small actions, Professor Elwell repeatedly interrupting him every time he spoke. Even changing the subject if he mentioned the military. The eye rolls, the sarcasm disguised as a chuckle, the humorous tone, all of it gradually formed a clear picture. This wasn't just about strictness in teaching, but prejudice cleverly wrapped in power. Tarek understood it, and though he was used to being underestimated, this time it no longer felt like an injustice, but a silent battle he was forced to face. The discussion of the things they carried marked a turning point. In front of the class, Professor Elwell turned to Tarek, her voice full of challenge. Surely you have a real perspective to share. He did not shy away. With his usual calm, Tarek replied that the emotions in the story were real, because the men he had served with, though they had survived, were still carrying more than they had ever carried on the battlefield. A few students nodded, but Elwell did not. This is not a therapy group. We are analyzing literature, not reliving military memories, she said sharply. The class fell silent. Tarek remained silent, but in his mind, he knew, the contempt was no longer implicit, it was out in the open. Elwell had gone from being a respected teacher to a symbol of cold power, using words to deny people their worth simply because of their background. Tarek did not respond, but his silence was no longer an evasion, it was the beginning of a deeper and more powerful protest than any excuse. As the third week passed, the invisible scars in Professor Elwell's treatment of Tarek became more and more apparent. No one said anything, but many eyes began to exchange suspicious glances whenever she interrupted him, dropped a sarcastic remark, and then turned away as if nothing had happened. But Tarek remained patient, until the personal writing assignment was assigned, a rare opportunity for students to express their true feelings related to a literary theme. Tarek chose to write about fear, not fear of bombs, but the empty fear after war, when everything was quiet again but the mind was still screaming. He wrote with all sincerity, without embellishment, without pity, and yet the result was still a C with two concise words at the top of the page, too personal. Those two words repeated over and over in his head. Other students had written about loss, about grief, from the deaths of loved ones to childhood traumas, and they weren't blamed for being too personal. But when it came to him, the personal became the fault. Tarek understood that the incident had now gone beyond the boundaries of grades or academic requirements. This was a blatant denial of his own real experiences, just because they didn't fit into Elwell's accepted model. He didn't get angry, didn't argue, but right after class that day, he walked up to the professor's desk and asked, in a calm voice, "I thought the assignment was about self-reflection." Elwell didn't look up, just said coolly, "Some experiences have too much baggage. Next time, pick something lighter." That answer, both indifferent and imposing, was the end of patience. Tarek didn't protest loudly, nor did he skip class. But inside him, the determination to stand up for himself was ignited, not by anger, but by reason, dignity, and careful preparation. Not everyone was astute enough to notice the silent war going on in that class. But by the fourth week, the tension between Tarek and Professor Elwell had become as tense as a string. The contempt was no longer hidden in sarcastic language or passing glances. It was evident in every action. every provocative question. During a discussion on truth distortion in literature, Elwell stood in front of the class and asked, "Do you have any examples of truth being manipulated for the sake of storytelling?" Tarek raised his hand, clearly, emphatically, but she deliberately chose someone else. When the class looked at him, she reluctantly nodded. Tarek told of a mission when he was in the military where the media reported only part of the truth, that the mission was successful. Clean, when the truth was that civilians had been injured. He spoke slowly, without accusation, simply sharing. Elwell tilted her head, asking sarcastically, "So you admit that the military you served in lied to the public?" Tarek remained calm. "I served to protect freedom, including the right to doubt." The answer silenced the class. And more than a few confused glances, partly admiration, partly shame for having been silent for so long. But Elwell did not stop. She turned away, murmuring loudly, "Blind loyalty and literature rarely go together." The remark was no longer an academic criticism, it was a blatant insult. Tarek did not respond. He just looked straight ahead. As if his eyes spoke for everyone, "I saw it all. I will not give up." And then, as other students began to approach him, some whispering, "You're out of line," others suggesting, "Sue me," Tarek knew he was no longer alone. His patience, it turns out, is what makes the silent one start to want to speak up. What hurt Tarek, after all, was not the grade, but the quiet, cold denial. During a group presentation of Toni Morrison's Beloved, a profound analysis of memory and trauma, Elwell once again stopped Tarek mid-speech. "That's too direct," she interrupted, sounding as if she'd just discovered a serious error. Then she turned to the class. "Trauma is more than just a physical wound. Some of us have been studying it for years. It can't be reduced to, something bad happened. And I was sad." No one in the group said anything. But everyone felt it, a slap in the face. At what Tarek had been through. Elwell was no longer evasive. No longer neutral. She was openly dismissive, openly mocking, openly denying the voice of someone who had lived through the very things literature was trying to describe. Tarek didn't argue. He just kept going, still going to class, still sitting in the same place, still submitting papers on time. But this time, he was no longer silent inside. He began to collect evidence, every word, every interruption, every inconsistent grading comment. He took the paper to the Student Support Center, asking for an objective review. The answer was the same, good writing. Clear, thoughtful, yet still the C's. Still the same cold comments like, lacking academic depth. Tarek understood, this was no longer an academic issue, but a power play, where he was seen as a symbol, not a student. And if Elwell dismissed the truth because it was not literary as she wanted, Tarek would prove it was the truth that made literature important. The climax of things came on the day of the class debate, a seemingly ordinary activity. But the stage where Tarek first spoke clearly and unignorably. When his name was called, Tarek stepped up to the podium, his face calm, notebook in hand as usual. He opened with a non-dogmatic argument: the morality of war is rarely black or white. Sometimes, the person who does the right thing can't sleep. The person who follows orders never asks, why? The classroom held its breath. This was no longer a lecture, but a living memory being portrayed with reason and heart. Elwell, not waiting long, interrupted in a skeptical tone. "How can we, those who weren't in the war, verify that? Literature is not the place to assert ourselves." Tarek looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "You were the one who asked us to use our own perspective to analyze." "I did." And then, like a crack opening, Tarek began to tell the story of a fateful night in a small village in Afghanistan. An explosion, 2 local translators killed. His unit was ordered not to respond for fear of hurting civilians. And then they lost everything, both their people and the village's trust. Sometimes war is not just about what you do, Tarek finished, his voice low but steady, but what you don't do, and have to live with it for the rest of your life. The class fell silent. Then there was applause, not loud, but genuine, from those who had silently watched him being treated unfairly. Elwell said nothing, but everyone knew the tables had turned. Tarek had not won with anger, but with truth and unyielding determination. After that debate, without any formal announcement, the truth was revealed. Tarek Holloway was no longer the silent shadow in the classroom. The story he told, with sincerity and care, not only cracked Elwell's mask of authority but also awakened those around him, the students who had been indifferent, now began to look at him with real respect. However, Tarek did not see that as the end. He understood that, for people like Professor Elwell, hurt honor does not lead to change, but often leads to behaviors that try to regain control. Instead of waiting for the next revenge, Tarek took the initiative. He made an appointment to meet with Dr. Lena Corbin, head of the literature department, bringing not anger, but evidence, detailed grading sheets, biased notes, and objective feedback from the Student Support Center were all carefully prepared by him. "I don't want anyone fired," Tarek said, looking straight ahead. "I just want to be judged on the work I put in." Corbin listened quietly, then said softly but powerfully, "You bring evidence, not emotion. That speaks volumes." It was this calmness that led her to review the entire paper herself, and to ask another instructor to re-evaluate it to ensure objectivity. A few days later, the results came back. Most of Tarek's papers should have been B's, even A's. Not only that, she asked Elwell to adjust all of his grades and admit that there had been bias in the assessment. While there would be no public disciplinary action, the admission would be kept on file internally, a silent reminder to anyone who misused his power. And for Tarek, that was enough to move on, not with anger, but with justice restored, since Professor Elwell was forced to adjust her grades and admit to bias in her grading. The atmosphere in the classroom had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. Elwell no longer addressed Tarek in a sarcastic tone. She no longer interrupted, no longer graded without transparency, no longer made sarcastic innuendos. To many, her silence might have been a sign of indifference. But to Tarek, who had faced every look, every word of prejudice, he knew it was a quiet retreat. Elwell's way of admitting defeat without saying it. Tarek was still the same, arriving early, sitting in the same place, listening and speaking with increasing calm and confidence. But this time, he was no longer alone in his persistence. The students who had once just watched, who had hesitated, now began to approach. Aaron, who had sat a few seats away from him, now sat next to him, exchanging notes and occasionally cracking jokes to lighten the mood. Louise, the first student to clap after his speech, now regularly asked him for feedback on her own writing. For the first time since the semester began, Tarek felt like a real part of the class, not the lost veteran, not the underdog, but a real student. He didn't need pity, he didn't need lavish praise. He just needed, and got, the respect he deserved for his efforts, his knowledge, and his humanity. And that was the biggest win. A few days before finals, Tarek received an email from the financial aid office. He had been awarded the Howard S. Monroe Journalism Fellowship, a small amount, but enough to cover books and some tuition for the next semester. Attached was a note from Dr. Corbin: "Your story has value. Keep writing." He printed out the email, folded it, and tucked it carefully into the back of his notebook, a silent reminder of the journey he had taken. The day of finals arrived, and Elwell walked into the classroom, handing out the papers as usual. But this time, she paused, without looking up, her voice low and brief. She said, "Regardless, I appreciate your efforts this semester." No one responded, but everyone understood. It was the only concession Elwell could make, not an apology, but a sign of change. After the exam, Tarek approached the lecturer's desk and said slowly, "I just hope that future students like me will not have to go through the same thing." For the first time, Elwell looked him straight in the eye. There was no coldness, no superiority, just a moment of silence and something like remorse. "I will remember that," she replied softly. He nodded, turned away, and walked out of the classroom for the last time. Outside, the chilly early winter wind blew through the bare trees. Tarek sat down in his usual chair, watching the people leaving amid the bustling laughter. He flipped through the notebook, past the crisscrossing red pages, the haunting notes, and stopped at the last page. On the white paper, he wrote 5 words: "This is just the start." No one could take that voice away from him, not a professor, not a prejudiced look, not an unfair grade. Tarek knew that the literature he was looking for was not found in books, but began with daring to tell his own true story.